They called it the city that never slept. But on the night Detective Jonah Reyes first heard about the child left on the fire escape, the city felt like it had gone quiet on purpose. Rain hung in long sheets off the eaves of the apartment buildings, and sodium streetlights turned puddles into bruises of light. Jonah had been awake for 17 hours, chasing leads that led mostly to dead ends, to the kind of small lies people tell to protect themselves or hide how little they know. He walked the block with his hands in his coat pockets and a cigarette he wasn't smoking between his lips because the habit was more comfort than appetite. The case that came through dispatch had been brief and deliberately clinical. Child found. Unresponsive. Cause unknown. Parents not at scene. The caller's voice had been flat, the kind that gets taught out of desperation and fear right after someone hangs up the phone. Jonah had driven through neighborhoods he could describe by smell. Grease and wet fire escapes, the sour tang of late-night money and coffee, until he reached the building with the peeling blue awning and the iron fire stairs. He climbed 2 flights, his shoes whispering on concrete, and found a small bundle on the second landing, wrapped in a thrift store blanket and lying as if someone had laid it down with a purpose, not a flurry. That purpose had a cruelty to it that made Jonah's chest cold. The child was a boy, maybe a year and a half, with black hair matted into the blanket and a bruise near the temple that looked as old as the rain. EMTs came and went, their movements practiced and efficient. In the minutes before the ambulance doors closed, Jonah went through the motions that take less time than people think. The questions, the names, the neighbors who said they'd seen nothing unusual and the ones who admitted they were too busy to notice. Someone finally mentioned a name. A woman who lived 3 floors up who had been screaming earlier and had since disappeared. Surveillance from the building's tiny camera showed a figure on the landing that could have been any adult's shadow in a stairwell that swallowed details. By morning, the kid was gone to the hospital, and the city had already shifted its attention toward other tragedies. A fire at a warehouse, a fight outside a deli, a mayoral speech about community safety. But Jonah couldn't make the sound of a baby's breath leave his head. He started diagrams in the margins of his notebook. Not because he believed in diagrams, but because they made the truth look like something he could catch in a pen loop. It was easier to hold a possible map than it was to hold the anxiety that a predator walked among them and chose a child like a calculation. He named the case in his head because naming things made them more manageable. Baby killer in the city. He hated the phrase, but it stuck, because of the way the timing and the bruise and the stray eyewitness reports combined into a pattern that felt deliberate. A couple of days later, a second infant turned up in a different neighborhood, this one left on the doorstep of a shuttered church with dried flowers at the altar. The child was alive for long enough to make the diagnostics difficult and urgent. The bruise was different, but the method, abandonment, exposure, precision, felt like the same hand. A message from someone who wanted to be heard without the decency of speech. The press started to notice. Late-night anchors used the phrase baby killer in their monotone, and the city's mothers started circling their phones like ship captains scanning fog. Jonah found himself on the edge of a media storm, but he preferred the solid and unspectacular work. Interviews with exhausted parents, late-night stakeouts, and keys in pockets that felt heavier than they should. He worked with Dr. Miriam Patel, a pediatrician and forensic consultant who smelled of jasmine and had the patience of a surgeon. She would examine each child and look beyond fresh bruises into the architecture of damage and care, and she began to see what Jonah couldn't yet, a modular pattern in the way the children were left. Times when roots were quieter, items placed with intention to avoid immediate discovery, blankets of a thrift store variety common in donation centers in the north side of the city. Someone was planning their steps. Jonah and his partner, Ana Cruz, began stitching together a time map. Ana was younger, sharp-tongued, and a marvel at reading people in a way Jonah had to learn. She leaned into interviews with a tone that let witnesses feel both safe and caught, and she brought local knowledge that Jonah didn't have. Together, they traced donations to shelters, visits to baby supply stores, and the recurring purchase of used blankets. They ran license plate checks and found a van that appeared in 2 cameras on nights before 2 different incidents, its plates obscured with grime. But the plates belonged to a rental company with hundreds of vans. Paperwork and bureaucracy turned their urgency into waiting rooms of forms. One evening, Ana called Jonah with the kind of breathless excitement that comes when a piece clicks into place. "There's a woman who keeps going into St. Bartholomew's on the East End," she said. She uses cash and leaves donations, but she always shows up again, like she's checking. I watched footage. She pauses at the back pew like she's counting them. Jonah felt a pull so immediate he almost cursed. They went to the church flashing badges, apologizing for the intrusion, and found an elderly caretaker who remembered someone. You know how some people pray loudly? She didn't pray. She just watched the babies in the donation bin like she was waiting for them to blink. They found the woman on the third meeting, sitting on a bench in a laundromat, her hair wrapped like a crown, her hands folded around a travel mug. She called herself Lila Reyes. She said she came to the church because she couldn't have children of her own and wanted to help. Lila's hands shook as she spoke, and Jonah watched her like someone watching a small animal. She cried easily and had stories about foster families and about being alone. Her alibi was complex. She had dates, receipts, but there was a softness to her memory that made Jonah suspicious and skeptical, in a way he didn't like to be about mothers who grieved publicly. They ran background checks and found a trail of foster care classes, a brief job at a day center for infants, and a medical record from years ago that suggested a traumatic birth. The records painted sadness. They also found nothing definitive. A tip came from a taxi driver who recognized Lila's walks. She frequented a small thrift mart on 12th Street that sold blankets like the ones found with the children. The owner remembered a woman buying identical blankets at odd hours, paying in cash and asking if anyone would come by to take donations at night. It was the kind of coincidence that slides into guilt like water under a bridge. A million small connections binding together into tension. When they brought Lila in for questioning, she was composed in the way people who have practiced grief become, with a thin smile and hollowing eloquence. She told them about loss, about watching other people's babies and wanting to cradle them. She insisted she had never hurt a child and had never abandoned one. Her phone records showed movement and calls that didn't quite fit the windows where incidents happened, but Jonah could not ignore the gut that told him something about her was true, and something else was staged. The city, hungry for answers, wanted a confession, a head to drop, a simple end to an impossible problem. But Jonah had been on the job long enough to know that the wrong enders would tell him what he wanted to hear, until the news trucks left. He wanted proof. He wanted a link that wasn't stitches and rumors. They widened the search. Camera footage from a laundromat, from a parking garage, from a bodega. A recurring shadow that moved with a deliberate, cat-like lithe economy. The shadow didn't match Lila's gait, and the van that had turned up again in camera feeds had been seen by multiple people near a clinic on the west side. West Side clinics catered to folks who didn't want questions asked, where records were sometimes loose and cash payments were routine. Jonah's investigator instincts hummed with the knowledge that if a person uses the edges of systems, shelters, donation centers, transient clinics, they can slip through a city's net because those edges are frayed. As days became weeks, the city counted its breaths and measured the sound of each one. Mothers latched doors and checked baby monitors twice. The mayor gave a speech that promised more lights in alleys and more patrols, and the police station got an influx of tips that ranged from the plausible to the absurd. A man called Claiming Angels left messages on his lawn. A woman swore the killer must be a doctor or a midnight priest. The world had become a darker eavesdropper than any detective. Jonah took to the streets at night with Ana, wearing plain clothes, listening to the way neighborhoods spoke in their rhythms. They sat in cars and watched for pattern, for someone who moved with an interest that didn't belong to them. In a soupy fog of November, they noticed a figure on the Riverwalk, early, watching a line of strollers being pushed by parents on their nightly walks. The figure's attention wasn't casual. It rested like hands on the handles of each stroller without contact. Jonah recognized the observation the way a musician recognizes a misplaced note. They followed. The figure was a man, mid-40s, with a coat too light for the weather, and a handsomeness that made strangers trust him in a way he used like a lever. He worked at a community center by day, giving talks on parenting and safe sleep and volunteers at donation drives. His name was Daniel Marks. He spoke like a man who'd been taught to be earnest, and he had references from families who vouched for his kindness. Jonah felt the old cold return. The city liked its monsters and hard faces rather than soft ones. Daniel's background checked clean except for an unfiled restraining order from a long-ago ex, who said he had been obsessive and controlling. But the man had been cleared in court. This was the moment when Jonah's professional resolve met its bitter sibling, the public love for easy villains. There were protests outside Daniel's building when his name leaked. The clinic where he volunteered demanded he step down. A woman who had taken his parenting class said he helped her sleep at night. Jonah saw the media feeding on each detail and realized with a small private panic that if they arrested Daniel without proof, they would have convicted a life on rumor. He also realized with a heavier truth that sometimes predators knew how to wear platitudes like armor. Then they found the ledger, a small notebook tucked inside a false bottom of a diaper bag belonging to a woman Daniel had dated years ago. It wasn't much, names, dates, shorthand remarks, but one entry had an address scribbled in a way that matched the building where the first infant had been left. In the margin, a word that looked like choreography, drop, go 200. Daniel said it was a journal of the classes he taught, a list of families who needed help. He said he kept notes. He cried a little in front of Jonah, and the cameras captured the moment. A man who loved children, a man who had been found wanting by the hungry town. Jonah put the pieces together differently. He believed a network more than a single actor. The notebook could be a map, a key to a pattern, but it also could be a convenient lie. Around the same time, Ana found a message board on a parenting forum, a private thread where strangers traded tips about reclaiming children. It read like the paranoid corners of the web where people whisper about rightful custody and rewards for returns. The usernames were throwaway, but one had an email connected to a recycling center that serviced the city's donation trucks. They traced trucks and met drivers who pointed to an intersection where people sometimes met in the dead hours to swap goods or stories. A driver remembered seeing a man with a coat too light for the weather. The driver remembered a woman who always bought blankets in sets and who left before dawn. But the driver also remembered someone else, a teenager who would stand by the alley and sign with a code. The neighborhood had become a cast of characters, a theater where each person had a role assigned by rumor. It was on a rain-soaked Tuesday that they caught someone on a camera they hadn't considered, a baby monitor camera, hooked to a daycare's outside security through an unsecured Wi-Fi network. Technology, for all its promise of connection, had left a backdoor. The footage showed a small, steady hand placing a bundle at the edge of a stoop, the camera catching the curve of a wrist and a ring with a cheap red stone. The hand moved with such care it looked like a benediction. They zoomed and matched the ring's serration pattern to a ring sold at a corner shop on Linden, the same shop that Lila sometimes visited. Lila's ring had a fault in the setting. The footage's ring had the same tiny chip. They brought Lila in again. The evidence was thin but constant like an ache. The ring, the thrift store receipts, the time she had been seen near donation bins. Under questioning, she broke in a way that made Jonah rethink his dislike for neat endings. She told them she had found a baby in a trash chute months earlier, that she had been desperate and scared and had taken the child to a shelter. But that wasn't official because she was ashamed. She admitted to watching donation bins in parishes because she needed to feel closer to babies she could not keep. She swore she had never hurt one. Her palms were calloused from work at a laundromat and from rocking hands that had wanted warmth. But then she said something that made Jonah's blood turn colder. She had seen someone occasionally, placing children in ways that looked rehearsed, that smelled of planning more than madness. She gave a description that matched Daniel's volunteer pictures. She said she had been too afraid to speak because she thought if she said his name, he'd know she could identify him. Her voice was small, and Jonah felt the moral geometry of the case sharpen like a blade. They surveilled Daniel without the clumsy theater of news. They walked the line between caution and accusation until they found a pattern. Daniel's volunteer calendar didn't always line up with bank records, and there were nights when he would vanish for hours only to return with laundry detergent and a linen-scented cologne he never admitted buying. On a night when fog pooled like old breath, they followed him to an industrial stretch near the river, where warehouses sat like black teeth. He met a woman there, their talk curt, their hands quick and businesslike. Jonah watched a hand exchange. A folded blanket passed like contraband. He moved in with Ana and a team. The angle of surprise snuffed potential performances and left two bodies arguing in the headlights. Daniel and a woman named Keisha, who worked at a shelter and had a record of temporary placements. Keisha's eyes were quick and her answers slick. She blamed the other, then the system, Then city poverty like a mirror to deflect attention. Under pressure, Keisha cracked. She spoke of a ring of people who exploited the edges of a collapsing safety net, of a clientele that wanted what they could not have, and of a barter system that treated infants as currency for favors. The portrait was not the tidy villain Jonah had imagined. It was a web of need and cruelty where kindness and corruption braided together. The people in the ring were not always monsters with singular intent. Sometimes they were ordinary folks whose choices were made monstrous by hunger and opportunity. In the end, the arrests were messy. They rolled in at dawn with too many flashbulbs in a city that wanted its narrative tied in a neat bow. Daniel was charged. Keisha was taken into custody. Lila was cleared of the worst accusations but flagged for further support. The ring's leaders were harder to name because some of the network existed in the shadows of official systems. Unpaid foster parents, cash clinics, and a recycling of favor for favors. The trial became a stain on the city's self-image, and the papers ran columns about systemic failure and human frailty. Jonah walked home on the morning after the arrests and felt no relief. He had wanted answers that felt clean, but the truth remained a messy human thing. He thought of the infants whose lives had been caught between hands that loved and hands that used, and of the mothers who slept with lights on and phones clutched like lifelines. He thought of how easy it was for systems to fray at the edges and how quickly desperation becomes a chain that drags.